With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
And good evening, everybody. Welcome to Tactics. Thank you so much for tuning in, whether you're on Facebook Live, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, Periscope, all of the venues that we broadcast on. We appreciate you being with us for this live broadcast on this Monday. Now, Monday, it's just, unfortunately, it's part of the system. It's part of the way that the news cycle works. We don't have a show Friday through Sunday, and a lot of news happens to build up, and a lot of people do that intentionally. But as always, local news does take top priority here, and so we are going to talk about something going on right here in the state of Alabama. So Doug Jones, and this is the headline that people have been running with, thinks he knows better than Alabamians. Now, this is not a new criticism. In fact, we've been saying this for a while now. And we're going to get into the meat and potatoes, give you a little bit of background, a little bit of context, and help you understand why this story really matters. So just to kind of give you a little bit of background on this, he did a piece on some of his votes for judicial nominees about 3 weeks ago. Doug Jones isn't the one that wrote it. He did an interview with National Journal, and they were expressing some of his ideas, some of his views on the way that he's been voting for judicial nominees. He has voted for approximately 60% of them, which is not particularly high, especially considering the state that he comes from. Now, every politician votes for, a decent percentage of the judicial nominees that come up. Doug Jones is not really an outlier. I believe that he's been a little bit more apt to vote for some of President Trump's nominations and nominees, but not at an irregular rate for a Democrat. And so they've been asking him about some of his decisions, some of his votes. And this is one thing that Trump has done a surprisingly good job at. And the reason I say surprisingly is because one of the big fears of me and other conservatives, one of the things that kept us up at night with President Trump going into the White House was, this is not a guy that's a policy wonk. He's not super knowledgeable about the job itself. And one area where he seems especially not good at, in other words, he's not well versed in this particular topic, are judicial nominees. And granted, that is a fair criticism of Donald Trump. He seems to be less knowledgeable about that legal side of it even than most presidential candidates, but even the average presidential candidate did not have a really firm knowledge of a lot of that. They do rely on other people that understand the judicial system, that sort of get an idea of the candidate, or in this case, the president's general ideas of what he would like to see in a judiciary, and then come up with judicial nominees that somewhat reflect that. But that was even more true in Trump's case, because he didn't really seem to have any kind of ideological stance on those things. But President Trump, to his credit, has done a really good job of appointing judges. And this was incredibly important, especially if you understand what was happening in the Obama administration, is that there was a hard tug to the left. And when I'm talking about a hard tug, I'm not talking about like someone grabs you by the shoulder. I'm talking about an 18-wheeler hits the side of your car and T-bones you. That kind of tug. That's what was going on with our court system, and the decisions that we saw coming out of the courts greatly reflect that. Obama he didn't pack the court, because that would imply that he was adding seats, for example, to the Supreme Court. He was definitely stacking the court, which, as a president, his right to nominate people, he has to get consent from the Senate, but it is his part of his appointed Article 2 powers to appoint. And then the Senate advises and consents. So I'm not necessarily lobbing a criticism of President Obama in the sense that he was doing anything unconstitutional, but he was very much stacking the court in an ideological left direction. And so it was really important for President Trump to start undoing some of that. And he's had a decent bit of success. But one area that Doug Jones has been especially, I wouldn't say that he's been worse on this than some other issues, because when it comes to things like abortion, for example, he's been particularly bad on issues like that. But on this issue, he seems to be more or less kind of in lockstep with the Democrats on this one. And so because of that, and because that's something that obviously his constituency in ruby red Alabama wouldn't necessarily agree with, I thought that National Journal did actually a pretty good job of asking him about that and asking him to respond and flesh that out. And his response to this was, I don't think people elected me to be a expletive rubber stamp. Now, why he felt the need to use that kind of language in a piece like this, I have no idea. But the point is that Doug Jones actually came out and said that he didn't think that, ignore that part of it for a second, that he believed that part of his job was he didn't want to be a rubber stamp. Now, to a certain degree, I completely understand what Doug Jones is saying. But there's a difference in being a rubber stamp and being a representation of what your constituents would want. I mean, a rubber stamp is just a guy that whatever the higher-ups tell him to do, smacks down the rubber stamp on that one. Yep, I approve. And that's not the Senate's job. That's not the Senate's job according to the Constitution. The Senate is supposed to advise and consent. So they are a check. That is one of the checks that Congress has against the President of the United States. That's part of the balance of power between the three branches. And so I agree with the general principle that Doug Jones is talking about, that you don't just because a warm body shows up and the president appointed him that you go, yep, approved, without even looking at the guy. Yeah, I get that. But you can be not a rubber stamp and still not be against the president's agenda. And that's really the difference here. This is a red herring fallacy that he's trying to lead you on with a completely separate argument that has nothing to do with what's being talked about here, because the question is about why are you voting in a way that your constituents would not want you to vote. That's different than being a rubber stamp. And unfortunately, and this may be a very small area where Doug Jones and I actually wound up agreeing if we were to talk, unfortunately in this state, I think a lot of people would actually prefer a rubber stamp. I mean, this is a very Trump-friendly state, and there are an awful lot of people that would prefer, yep, any nominee the president puts forward, don't even look at the guy's name, just throw down the approval stamp. Okay, there are people in the state that would like that. Unfortunately, it's probably a pretty good chunk. I doubt it would be a majority, but there are an awful lot of Republicans in the state of Alabama that, yep, whatever Trump does, we're good with it. I mean, it's sad, it's unfortunate, and ironically enough, we're going to see what's going to happen in the election in 2020, because even though I hope it doesn't happen, and even though I think that this would be a really dumb idea, Tommy Tuberville has a very good chance of winning the nomination to take Doug Jones' seat. And basically what Tommy Tuberville has campaigned on thus far is being a rubber stamp for Donald Trump. Anything that Donald Trump does, I approve of it. So unfortunately, because we do have a candidate that's basically running that campaign, we will get to find out very shortly whether or not the rubber stamp theory is correct from Senator Doug Jones, because if they vote to replace him with Tommy Tuberville, who has basically campaigned and been very open about, I'm basically just going to be a rubber stamp for the president. Anything Trump is for, I'm for. Anything Trump is against, I'm against. Unfortunately, we'll get to see in real time whether or not that theory plays out. In other words, whether or not the voters of Alabama really do want a rubber stamp guy or not when it comes to the president. But again, getting back to the overall argument here, there's a difference in saying, well, I don't want to be a rubber stamp, and saying, well, I'm going against the president. I'm actively working to undermine his policies and to keep some of his judicial appointments out. And that is what is going on here. Because I don't want a guy that's a rubber stamp either. But you can be a rubber stamp and not vote against people who are originalist and textualist and good judiciary nominees, which unfortunately Doug Jones has done on a fairly regular basis. And that's the difference. Don't try to hide behind, well, I don't want to be a rubber stamp. Well, you could say that about just about anything. And as long as you have one vote where you disagreed with somebody, then you could say, well, I'm not being a rubber stamp. Well, that doesn't justify all of the votes. You're talking about two completely things. That's why this is a red herring fallacy. But another thing that he said here, and we'll get into a little bit more of that in this point, is he said that there is a difference in political agenda and judicial philosophy. Well, that's true. Most of the time. There is a difference in political philosophy, your political leanings, your political agenda, and judicial philosophy, unless you're a liberal. And here's why. If you are a textualist or you are an originalist when it comes to the law, in other words, you believe that the text of the law should be taken seriously, and that if the text is somehow vague or there could be multiple meanings, that you go back to the original intent. If you believe that about the law, which is all I want in a judiciary, I don't want a guy that's pro-business. I don't want a guy that's pro-poor person. I don't want a guy that goes for conservative ideals. I don't want a guy that's going to say anything that was supported by Republicans, that's constitutional. Anything that was supported by Democrats, that's not constitutional. I don't want a conservative judge. I want somebody that looks at the law and says, yep, constitutional, unconstitutional. That's all I want. That is all I want. Somebody that actually looks at the original meaning of the law and the original text of the law, and from that discerns, okay, that's what they intended. That's what the law actually means. That's what they're talking about. Therefore, that is constitutional. That is unconstitutional. That's it. It's not hard. It's not complicated. It's not political at all. See, that is an example of a difference between what Doug Jones is talking about here, political agenda, and judicial philosophy. Because when we're looking at these two ideologies, when you're looking at somebody that is an originalist or a textualist, they may occasionally, as a judge, make a decision that they don't like. Perfect example of that, Antonin Scalia. He did not like the fact that people were burning flags. Yet, he ruled in favor of the people burning flags. Why? Because, yes, he had a political agenda, but he was a judge. So he put that aside and said, whether or not I like what they're doing, whether or not I want this law to be in effect, doesn't matter. The Constitution says they have a right to free speech and free expression, and that's part of that. And Justice Scalia also said, and this is correct, it rings true today, that if you are a good judge, you are going to make some judicial decisions. In other words, you're going to side with some judicial philosophies that you don't necessarily like. Because it's not your job to pass things that you like. You're not a lawmaker. You're not a politician. You're a judge. And so the only thing you're supposed to do is figure out whether the law says this or whether this says this, and whatever the law says is what's supposed to go. And so, yes, there is a variation in judicial philosophy and political agenda. But if you're on the Doug Jones side of this, if you're on the liberal side of this, they don't want judges, they want activists. They want people that look at a law and say, I think the law should be this, so I'm going to rule on this side. I mean, that's been true of the liberal justices, the ones that say, well, the Constitution's a living, breathing document. What that means is, well, we can interpret it to mean whatever we want it to mean. We're going to make it say what we want it to say. See, in their mind, there is no difference in political agenda and judicial philosophy. Not really. Now, granted, you will occasionally get a moment of sanity. For example, I want to say it was 2 years ago now, even Sotomayor and Breyer and Ruth Bader Ginsburg looked at one particular case. This doesn't really surprise me as much with Kagan, even though she sided on the prevailing side as well. They looked at this one particular case where, oddly enough, an Asian band were calling themselves, and this was their name, they're Asian, so don't ban me from YouTube for saying this, because this was the actual name of their band. I'm just going over the details of the case. They referred to themselves as the Slants. Which, granted, is pretty funny. But the reason that they were in court in the first place, the reason this made it up to the Supreme Court is they were saying, well, that's hate speech, that's a racial slur, you can't say that. And all 9 judges ruled, sorry, free speech. Which was the correct outcome. That was what was supposed to happen. So occasionally you will get, because I don't know, I would guess that Sotomayor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg probably would have rather had some kind of legal system to where you could punish that, but nonetheless they ruled, okay, this is the First Amendment, this is America, they have free speech, ergo, they win. That's really what it boiled down to. And so you will occasionally get that, but by and large, on the left, by and large, they want the law, they want to rewrite the law to make it say what they want it to say. I mean, they rewrote, for example, Obamacare 4 separate times. And that was Justice Roberts doing that sided with that, where they literally changed the words of the law in order to make it constitutional. It wasn't constitutional, so they figured out a way to make it constitutional. It's not what a judge is supposed to do. And so I agree with Doug Jones on some level to where he's saying, well, there's supposed to be a difference in judicial philosophy and political agenda. Well, yes, normally that is correct. However, your side, the ones that you are on the side of, they're the ones that don't believe that believe that their political agenda should be their judicial philosophy and the two should be essentially interchangeable. That whatever they want to happen is what they'll figure out a way to make happen. And it's laughable hearing a Democrat that does not subscribe to the ideas of textualism or originalism start talking about, well, there's a difference in political agenda and judicial philosophy. And another thing that is also important to understand about all this is that Jones did a complete 180 on Judge Brasher at the last second. So Judge Brasher, very well respected, he was the Solicitor General in the state of Alabama. He green-lighted Brasher's nominee all the way up until the last second, and when it finally came time to vote, he voted no. Which is odd. It's almost like he was going to vote for Judge Brasher, and then all of a sudden decided at the last second, no. Why would someone do that? Why would they make that last second change? Maybe because Chuck Schumer told him to vote no. See, here's the hilarious thing about this whole episode, is that the first quote that we read, that Doug Jones is saying, well, I don't think that I was elected to be a rubber stamp. Except he is. He's just not a rubber stamp for Trump. He is a rubber stamp. He's just a rubber stamp for Chuck Schumer. And that's the problem that Alabamians have had with him. Because he ran on this. Now, I never believed this. And if you did believe it, then I've got a bridge that I can sell you. But I never believed this lie. But Doug Jones campaigned on the idea that, I'm not going to be somebody that's just another Nancy Pelosi or a Chuck Schumer. I'm my own man. I think for myself. I do my own thing. And yet we have this and other bills where Doug Jones seemed to be going one way and then all of a sudden changed his mind. It's almost like somebody got to him and said, look, you're going to vote this way on this bill. The truth is that whenever Chuck Schumer holds up a hoop, Doug Jones almost wets himself with excitement getting to jump through it. I mean, this is a guy that, as I've said for a while now, I think he's pretty much determined that he's not going to be in the Senate much longer because he sees the handwriting on the wall, and he is doing everything he can to ingratiate himself to the DNC. He is doing his absolute dead level best trying to get some kind of job to get in the good graces of the people in the Democrat Party so that he can later procure some kind of cushy job, because he realizes it's going to be very hard for him to get anything as prestigious as a senator within the state of Alabama. He'd have to essentially move to get another office like that. So that seems to be what's going on here. And here's another fascinating thing in this piece. He said the people in Alabama, voters, didn't do the due diligence I did. And that was in reference to the Kavanaugh hearing. They were asking him, why is it that even though Kavanaugh had a lot of support in Alabama, you decided to vote against Kavanaugh in the last minute? And he says, well, the voters in Alabama, they didn't do their due diligence like I did. Now, again, this is an argument that Jones is making where there is a kernel of truth, and I agree with at least some of the overall premise. Part of the reason that we have elected officials and we are a republic instead of a democracy is specifically because, and this is a case that was laid out in the Federalist Papers, that it's not that the average person is too stupid to make these decisions. It's more that the person does not have the time to research these in depth, and because of that, they defer to elected officials that they have elected that sort of hold their general principles and that they want to do the right thing given all the information. So, in a sense, representative officials are essentially a proxy for the will of the people so that the people can't be easily swayed by information on cases that they do not have all the information or don't have time to do proper research in. So there is a kernel of truth and a where I understand at least where Jones is coming from on this. But here's the problem. Again, this is another red herring. Because in Kavanaugh's case, what due diligence was there to do? That's the thing that I find so fascinating about this. And keep in mind, I'm somebody that did do their due diligence. I was reporting on this the entire time, keeping up with it, taking in as much information as possible. And the more due diligence I did, the more I realized there was really not any due diligence to do. Because this was a case where there was no evidence. I mean, none. Zero. And so you could say, well, I saw the evidence. Well, what evidence did you see? There was no evidence to be seen. All you had was testimony of an eyewitness that says it happened, but can't even prove that she knew the man, much less that he actually did what she claimed he did. And by the way, a lot of people, the entire nation was watching that, so I'm kind of confused on what he's talking about the due diligence, because yes, there are very complicated political matters that the average citizen does not understand because they don't have time to do that level of research. I get that. As somebody who usually does the research, I understand that that's a pretty common occurrence. And as somebody in the business that spends a large chunk of his waking hours researching politics, I understand that there is too much for any one human being to ever do enough research on. Can't be done. There's just too much information out there. But nonetheless, this is one of those cases where that doesn't make a whole lot of sense because there was no evidence to look over. There wasn't anything really there. And so I don't understand where Jones is coming from on that perspective because he said, well, they didn't do their due diligence. Well, what else did you need to know, Doug? And the reason that he's presenting this red herring fallacy is because he's trying to distract from the fact that he didn't have a reason, he didn't have any evidence. And so he's trying to push, well, there's this phantom evidence, there's this phantom information that I was privy to that nobody else was. That, well, the average Alabamian, they didn't really know that. They didn't really have access to that, and so I made the call. What information? Because it seems to me that if Doug Jones had any evidence, that he should have, come forward with that, considering we had none during that whole 3 or 4 week fiasco. If Doug Jones has some kind of secret store of information on Brett Kavanaugh's history in high school, you'd think he would have come forward with that. All of this is just to disguise the fact that he did exactly what the Democrat Party wanted, ignored what the people of Alabama wanted, and got away with it scot-free. That's the only thing that's going on here. And he doesn't have a good explanation of why he voted against Kavanaugh other than, I wanted to make the Democrats happy. That's the only explanation the man has. And he knows that that's not going to play well, so he doesn't say it. That's the reason that you're getting this kind of response. There was one other thing he sort of added to this. And I look them in the eye and tell them, here's the thing about it. If somebody had acted the way with you and you saw that kind of demeanor, I don't think you would have hired that person. So, in other words, you are citing a completely intangible, subjective quality, just you not liking the guy, as the reason that you completely went against your constituents and voted against the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm not even sure that I vote for Brett Kavanaugh if I was the senator from Alabama, simply because he's not really an originalist or a textualist in certain areas. I mean, he's sort of a moderate Anthony Kennedy type. Not quite to the level of Kennedy. I'd say he's maybe slightly to the right of Roberts, if that. But my point in all of this is, Doug Jones's rationale comes from literally nowhere. Just, I didn't like his demeanor. That's not a reason to not appoint somebody as a judge. It doesn't make any sense, but Doug Jones has nothing, and he's trying to hide the fact that he has nothing. And by the way, an interesting video has recently surfaced about Doug Jones, where he again is trying to conceal the fact that he's got nothing.
Just keep your comments to a minimum, okay?
Okay.
Thank you.
Senator, why do you think that you know better than Alabamians about Trump's judges?
Who are you?
My name is Derek.
Why are you here, Derek?
Doing my job.
For who?
Oh, Jesus, I just ran to try and catch you out of the back door.
Who are you doing a job for?
Colorado Rising Action.
Who's that?
Whew. Doesn't matter. I think what's most important is why you think you know better than Alabamians.
You ask a pretty dumb question.
You think it's a dumb question?
We'll see you there. Take care, man.
All right, so there's the video of Doug Jones. He's confronted by somebody, and there's an event he's doing in Colorado. And the guy just asked him, why do you think that you know Alabamians? Why do you think you know better than Alabamians on some of these judicial appointments? So this is in reference to the things that we've just gone over, the things we've just been talking about, and some of the things that Jones has said in the past. But the important thing to really understand about this is, I do think that even though I don't much care for Doug Jones, he deserves a little bit of grace here, and here's why. First of all, he is ambushed. He's just walking from whatever event he was doing to his car, munching on his ice cream sandwich, which I genuinely hope, and I'm not being sarcastic here, I hope that nobody licked his ice cream sandwich. Nobody licking that and putting that back in the freezer at Walmart or whatever. But, Doug Jones, he's not there. It's not an official press release. He's not there to answer questions. He's just walking to his car when a reporter comes up and starts asking him questions. So he is caught off guard a little bit, and it's understandable that he's not necessarily on top of his game when this is happening to him in a very unexpected way. And let's be honest, the question is worded in sort of a condescending way, and it's one of those that is specifically phrased in such a way that there is no right answer. I mean, it's kind of like the when did you stop beating your wife question. There's no good answer for that, because anything that you say sounds bad, even if it's not actually bad. And so this is really the same kind of thing, is that it's worded in such a way that, why do you think you know better than Alabamians on this stuff? But the reason that it's worded that way, and again, I'm not, I would have worded it a little differently, honestly, less like an ambush question, but let's be honest. The reason that it's worded that way is because essentially that is what Doug Jones said. When it came to the Kavanaugh hearing, you just heard the comment that I read, and I read it verbatim. He said that when it came to that they didn't do the due diligence that I did. In other words, I knew better than my constituents on this, and that's the reason I voted that way. Which again begs the question, why? The question that he's asking is a legitimate question. Okay, you've told us that you believe that you knew better than your constituents, that you believe that Kavanaugh was not fit to be a Supreme Court justice, and they obviously did. And for whether it was you were privy to some kind of special information that nobody can seem to locate, what is the rationale? What is the reason for that? Because you can't just say, I know better than the people of Alabama. Peace. See y'all later. That doesn't work. That's not an explanation. If you want to explain your vote, here's your chance. And first of all, when it comes to people that seem to be at odds with their constituents, which this happens even with really good senators, people that I consider really good senators like Rand Paul, occasionally he gets on the side of an issue that his constituents do not like. And so it's a very run-of-the-mill, honestly, pretty basic political question to ask a politician on any level. Why is it that you went the other direction than the people that elected you on this one? That's a fair question. But again, Doug Jones has no good explanation for it, and that is why he offers none. But the whole thing, and this is the reason that it's going to be a problem for him politically, and it's also the reason that Doug Jones, because this is really the sentiment, this seems to be the guy's attitude about it, and this is the way that he comes off. I mean, he essentially comes off as, "How dare you country fried rubes in Alabama question my intelligence, question my judgment. I am the great Doug Jones. Worship me. Ha 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 ha." Now, is that a little over the top? I don't know, maybe. But the point is, that's how it comes off. Whether or not it's true, and I think that you could make the case that it is true, because you look at the guy's voting record, you look at the way that he campaigned, talking about how so many people are embarrassed to say that they're from Alabama, the way that he talks about the state, the way that he runs it down, and then comes up with this stuff where he's basically saying, well, I know better than the people in Alabama. I do. I know better than them. Whether or not it's true, and I think it is, that is the sentiment, that is the attitude that is reflected in Doug Jones, not only in his voting record, but more importantly, in the way that he responds to it, in the way that he explains the votes that he's made. And unfortunately, that's probably going to be the reason that there is very little chance that Doug Jones gets reelected no matter who he's running against in the 2020 election. All right, we'll take a break and we'll be back in just a little bit.
And now for a reading from the Social Justice Warrior Bible with Pastor Gregory Post.
Welcome in. I'm Gregory Post, head pastor at the Eternal Living Word Trans-Denominational Community Church and Coffee House in Novato, California. Now it's time for a reading from the SJW Bible. Today's reading will come from Leviticus chapter 10, verses 1 through 10. Now Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took their respective fire pans, and after putting the fire in them, placed incense on it and offered strange fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. And the fire came out of the presence of the Lord, which created a wicked cool light show for them to see, and totally got everyone feeling the Spirit's presence. Then Moses said to Aaron, "It is what the Lord spoke, saying, even though I didn't command you to use this strange fire, I totally understand your need to express yourselves in worship and keep yourselves entertained." So Aaron therefore danced and yelled with joy, knowing that his sons were having a good time at worship. Moses called out to Mishael and Ezaphan, and the son of Aaron's uncle Uzziel, and said to them, "Come forward, carry your relatives away in front of the sanctuary outside of the camp, for they have fainted from being overwhelmed by the power of God's coolness." So they came forward and carried them still in their tunics outside the camp, as Moses had said. Then Moses said to Aaron and his sons Eleazar and Ithamar, "Do not uncover your heads, nor tear your clothes, because God wants us to always be happy, and as long as we're happy, He's happy. Therefore, if worship doesn't give you an overwhelming sense of euphoria, you need to find another congregation, preferably one with a more dynamic pastor and band." So they did according to the word of Moses. And the Lord spoke to Aaron, saying, "Do not drink wine or strong drink, neither you nor your sons with you, when you come into the sanctuary, so that you will be able to drink more once you arrive. It is a perpetual statute throughout your generations. And so as to make a distinction between the holy and the profane, between the unclean and the clean, because when worship stops being fun or feels judgy, then it becomes profane and unclean." Wow, so inspiring. This has been a reading from the SJW Bible, and remember, the only truth that matters is your truth.
And welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for sticking with us through the break. And we're going to go ahead and jump to something else because this is a story that I think it's not going to be something that I think moves the needle on public opinion much. But I do think, what's the best way to say this? I think that it's culturally important. And I think one thing that it does is it really rips the mask off of some of the thought processes that undergird Planned Parenthood. In other words, the guiding principles that direct it as an organization. Now, many of us have been screaming from the rooftops that this is the kind of people they are for a really long time, but this is just a really good display of that. So you may have heard that recently, just a few days ago actually, that Leana Wen, who is the president of Planned Parenthood, or at least was until about 6 days ago, that Leana Wen has left Planned Parenthood, and this was something that came as somewhat of a surprise to some people. Honestly, it didn't surprise me that much just because they had already had a very public spat, and based on her explanation of why she left Planned Parenthood, a lot of these things that were talked about not long after she was appointed turned out being exactly the same issues to a great degree that wound up with her resigning. So she actually wrote a post from the New York Times. And if you've already done like me and reached your quota of things that you can read on the New York Times for this month, don't worry, I've got you covered. I have a copy of it right here. So we're going to go through the article, and I don't know if we're going to read the entire thing, but I want to go through most of it. And the reason that I think it's important to do this is because it's in her words. And remember, this is somebody that was the president of Planned Parenthood. So not a pro-lifer, not somebody that is making suggestions from the outside of what Planned Parenthood is like. This is somebody that has worked their way up through the system of Planned Parenthood, seen it at every level. And this is her takeaway. And by the way, somebody that still to this day is pro-choice. Now, as important as people like Abby Johnson and other Planned Parenthood people that have gone the opposite direction and turned against abortion, as important as they are, and they are, the reason that this is an interesting perspective is because this is somebody who has had some apparent deep-seated disagreements with Planned Parenthood, and yet still supports abortion, still believes in the mission or the goal or whatever as she calls it. And it's important to understand a little bit of Wen's background. This is a woman who was a Chinese immigrant that came to America as a small girl, and the reason that she got turned on to Planned Parenthood and the reason that she wound up having a favorable opinion of them at a very young age is because her parents were very poor, and her mother used some kind of health services with Planned Parenthood. Now, whether she got an abortion there, I have no idea. She's kind of vague about that. But the point is, her mother used some services from Planned Parenthood, being somebody that was monetarily not very wealthy. And so because of that, she had a favorable opinion of Planned Parenthood. She went on up through the ranks. And this is really where she kind of landed, which, first of all, there's a healthy dose of irony there that she is a immigrant from China as a female child. Do you know how insane that is? If you're a girl in the womb in China, you are rolling the dice with your existence. Because what happens over there is, by and large, and by the way, China is one of the biggest countries for abortion. They have a one-child rule. You're only allowed to have one. And because of that, and because of the way they are culturally, that if the first child you do the ultrasound and find out, oh, it's a girl, usually you're aborted because they want the honor of having a son, which I have yet to figure out why the abortion activists aren't at the very least saying, okay, well, that's sexist at the very least. That because they favor men and don't want a female child and they only get one child, very few parents opt to actually carry their female baby to term and then have it. And in this case, it's amazing to me that somebody that barely escaped death, being a female child in China, I mean, the odds of you surviving that are incredibly small. That she barely escapes the jaws of death, as it were, in the form of abortion, and then becomes the president of the largest abortion provider in the United States. And look, I'm going to use this analogy. Don't take it overly seriously. I know that I'm going to catch flack for this on the internet. It's kind of like a Jew escaping Nazism in Germany or Poland or somewhere else that was occupied by the Germans at the time, coming to America and joining the Nazi Party USA. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but that's what happened. Now, again, even though there are some similarities and some similar tactics, I'm not saying that everybody that works at Planned Parenthood is a Nazi. That's why it's an analogy. I'm not saying they literally are. I'm saying there is a similarity in this one particular situation. So, don't freak out over that. But anyway, that's really where we are, and that's the context in which this person was reared. And now she goes through the process, becomes a member at Planned Parenthood, becomes an associate that works for them, works their way all the way through the system, all the way to president, takes Cecile Richards' job, is the top dog over the entire organization, and winds up leaving it. And so this is her explanation from the New York Times. Leana Wen, Why I Left Planned Parenthood. Quote, "This week I left my position as the president and chief executive of Planned Parenthood. In my farewell message to colleagues, I cited philosophical differences over the best way to protect reproductive health. While the traditional approach has been through prioritizing advocating for abortion rights, I have long believed that the most effective way to advance reproductive health is to be clear that it is not a political issue but a healthcare one. I believe that we could expand support for Planned Parenthood, and ultimately for abortion access, by finding common ground with the large majority of Americans who can unite behind the goal of improving health and well-being of women and children. When the board hired me to chart this new course, I knew that it would be challenging. Few organizations, let alone organizations under constant siege, accept change easily. Indeed, there was immediate criticism that I did not prioritize abortion enough. While I am passionately committed to protecting abortion access, I do not view it as a standalone issue. As one of the few national healthcare organizations with presence in all 50 states, Planned Parenthood's mandate should be to promote reproductive health care as a part of a wide range of policies that affect women's health and public health. All right, so what she's referencing here, to help you understand what's going on, just weeks after she was appointed as the new president of Planned Parenthood, there was a very public feud between her and the board of directors and the other higher-ups within Planned Parenthood over exactly this. This is what I was talking about a second ago. What happened is that she was wanting to prioritize women's health overall, sort of as an umbrella, and not talk specifically about abortion so much. That what she was trying to do is not necessarily even change the amount of services, just emphasize the other services other than abortion that are presented when it comes to Planned Parenthood. So, in other words, she's not saying let's do less abortions and let's do more, I don't even know the other services that they do, pregnancy testings or ultrasounds. She wasn't even saying that, even though they only do ultrasounds for the doctor so the doctor can see the baby. But anyway, she wasn't even saying let's do that. She was saying, let's just talk more about those things. So she's not even talking about doing less abortion. She's just talking about not mentioning abortion as much and mentioning some of the other things more often. And apparently that's the thing that very early on already put her at odds with the people at Planned Parenthood. That alone was enough to gather their ire. And you'll remember that if you'll go back, and I actually did a segment on this, if you'll remember when you go back to when she was first hired and that whole event took place, that what happened as a response to that was that she came out with a tweet, and I don't remember exactly how it was worded. I was unable to find it in my archives, but she came out with a tweet that straight up said, abortion is the primary goal of Planned Parenthood. So she believes that, is willing to say that, but is just saying, hey, can we, occasionally in our literature or occasionally when we're doing our talking points, can we just emphasize these things a little more and maybe not talk about abortion as much? Still says it's the number one priority, still says it's the mission and goal of Planned Parenthood. But can we talk about this a little bit more? And the people at Planned Parenthood were saying, no, not going to do it. Not happening. Wow. I mean, if you ever wanted to categorize somebody as a religious zealot, that's the only thing that I can think of when it comes to how committed Planned Parenthood is to emphasizing abortion and abortion only. That somebody like this, that is a true believer, that likes abortion, that wants to expand Planned Parenthood's influence, is just saying, hey, let's talk about this a little more. And Planned Parenthood's like, not happening. That's pretty astounding to me. It continues on. Another area of contention was my attempt to depoliticize Planned Parenthood. The organization and the causes it stands for have long been in the crosshairs of political attacks. In the last few months, 7 states have passed laws banning abortion before many women even know that they are pregnant. Proud to be from one of those states. Just this past Monday, the Trump administration announced that it would start enforcing a gag rule that would prohibit doctors and nurses working in federally funded clinics from referring patients to abortion care. I had been leading our organization's fights against these attacks and believe they offer even more reason for Planned Parenthood to emphasize its role in providing essential health care to millions of undeserved women and families, underserved women and families. People depend on Planned Parenthood for breast exams, cervical cancer screenings, HIV testing, and family planning. To counter those who associate the organization with only abortion and use this misconception to attack its mission, I wanted to tell the story of all of its services, and in doing, to normalize abortion care as the health care it is. If you distill everything that she just said in those past 2 paragraphs, basically what she is saying, and granted this is coming from her perspective, basically what it all comes down to what she is saying is, I wanted to say this isn't all about politics. The people at Planned Parenthood disagree. And by the way, it should be important to note here, even though she doesn't mention this in this article, that there was reporting from BuzzFeed before this article even came out that said that one of the big points of contention between Wen and the people at Planned Parenthood and the job that she was doing was that she refused to emphasize trans rights. In other words, she was unwilling to change the words her and woman out of their literature or their brochures or their website or whatever other communications they have. Because Wen was saying, no, we should be focusing on women. And they're saying, well, trans men are women. Which in other words, what they're saying is women who think that they're men that dress like Wen who may need an abortion. And Wen was like, no, we're not going to emphasize that. It should be about women and we should push it as women. And the people at Planned Parenthood vehemently disagreed with this. Planned Parenthood is nakedly a political engine of the left. It's one of their bigger donors, not their biggest, but one of their bigger. They're not as big as like teachers' unions and organizations like that. But they're a very big political donor, and they are ensconced in leftist ideology. Is abortion a big part of it? Sure, it's definitely their number one priority. Wen herself said that. But when it comes to ideological things that really have nothing to do with healthcare, Planned Parenthood has no problem taking a stand on a hill to die on, that has nothing to do with women's health. And that seems to be the big discrepancy, the big issue that Wen was having with the people that are over Planned Parenthood, the board of directors and everybody else. That was the issue that was going on here, is that they were trying to incorporate leftist doctrine into every aspect of what they do, and Wen was having none of it. And so there was a obvious disagreement there, not just from what should we emphasize that we actually do when it comes to services, but also should we just be nothing but a political engine for the DNC? And the board of directors at Planned Parenthood obviously feels that yes, they absolutely should. A common, very common actually, argument against the NRA, for example, is that they have their hands in too many different issues that are unconnected to gun rights. I think that's a fair criticism from time to time. There are times where, as an organization, as individuals, some of the people that are the higher ups take a stance on a certain issue that has nothing to do with gun rights. But here's the thing. That's a stance that they take as individuals. The organization itself doesn't really do any of that. This is Planned Parenthood as a corporate entity, as an organization, saying, no, we are going to take this stance, even though it has nothing to do with the services that we offer, because we are a political engine of the left. And Wen didn't like that. And I will like to point out a little bit of hypocrisy here, that Wen is talking about depoliticizing it so that they can drum up more support for Planned Parenthood by essentially not talking about the primary thing that they do. That seems like an odd strategy to me. Maybe an effective one, I don't know, but it's certainly odd. But another thing that she points out here is, do you notice how Planned Parenthood is always all about abortion, right up until the federal budget is being debated? Because they don't want to lose that, $500 million coming from the Fed. And the only way that they can do that, because there is actually a law on the books that says that money can't go to abortion at the federal level. So a federal entity cannot give money to an abortion clinic if that's all they do. And so Planned Parenthood talks about abortion until all of a sudden the budget comes up for debate. And then it's, we barely even do abortions. It's not even really a thing that we're really all that committed to. It's like only 3% of the services we offered, which, by the way, is a lie that even the Washington Post fact checker gave, I think, 4 Pinocchios, the highest rating they could give. I mean, it's absurd that they're all about abortion right up until the budget is being debated, and then all of a sudden, we don't even do abortions. I don't know what you're talking about. That's not what we do at all. It's blatant that they're a political engine, but she continues on. For me as a physician, I was also simply good. It was also simply good medical care to treat the whole patient. There were already some Planned Parenthood health centers that provided full spectrum care. In one clinic I visited, a new mother could get a checkup while her baby was vaccinated. If she was diagnosed with postpartum depression, she could receive mental health services right there too. With high-quality, affordable health care out of reach for so many, Planned Parenthood has a duty to maximize its reach. I began efforts to increase care for women before, during, and after pregnancies, and to enhance critically needed services like mental health and addiction treatment. But the team that I brought in, experts in public health and health policy, faced a daily internal opposition from those who saw my goals as a mission creep. There was even more criticism as we worked to change the perception that Planned Parenthood was just a progressive political entity and show that it was first and foremost a mainstream healthcare organization. So, really, what you get out of that is that Wen was a true believer. Wen actually believed in this lie that Planned Parenthood has been peddling for decades, that Planned Parenthood is anything other than an abortion mill. You see, to Planned Parenthood, the other services that they offer, things like HIV screening, which are not bad things in and of themselves, they're very good things, obviously. And it's good that they specifically help people that can't afford it. Not everything that they do is horrible. But their primary objective is the killing of children, so yeah, that kind of washes all that under the bridge. But nonetheless, Wen actually believed that lie that was being peddled for years, saying that Planned Parenthood's not a political entity. Planned Parenthood doesn't just do abortions, it's about women's health overall. Isn't that what we've been hearing forever? That's the lie that they've been peddling, and Wen actually bought into it. She was an actual believer of that statement, and when she got to the top and tried to implement that goal, she got met with resistance, saying, no, we are an abortion provider, and that's pretty much all we are. You see, to them, those other services and that message that they've been putting out there, that's just political cover. That is political cover so that they can justify doing more abortions. To Wen, she actually believed that that was important, and when she got to the top, she realized, oh, it's actually not. All they care about is abortion. And it was, I'm sure, a shock to her because she had bought into that propaganda that Planned Parenthood has been peddling for years, that those of us on the right have been saying for years that it's total crap. And this proves it. She continues on. Perhaps the greatest area of tension was over our work to be inclusive of those with nuanced views about abortion. I reached out to people who wrestle with abortion's moral complexities, but who will speak out against government interference in personal medical decisions. I engaged in those who identify as being pro-life, but who support safe, legal abortion access because they don't want women to die from back alley abortions. I even worked with people who oppose abortion but support Planned Parenthood because of the preventative services we provide. We share the desire to reduce the need for abortion through sex education and birth control. Now, I think that this is significant, not because it's something that's new, but it does show that there is a pervasive culture in Planned Parenthood that they don't even really want to engage with anybody that doesn't believe in abortion. Even somebody that considers themselves pro-life, or even someone that considers themselves pro-choice, but isn't 100% on board with abortion on demand at any point in the pregnancy. Which would mean what? That there's really only about 13% of Americans that Planned Parenthood would approve of. And that's the 13% that abortion on demand anytime from the time of conception to the time of it's out of the birth canal, whenever you can do it 5 minutes before birth, you go ahead and you kill it. Anybody that isn't a extreme radical on abortion, Planned Parenthood wants nothing to do with them. Because Wen was apparently, I don't know what she was doing specifically, but at least on paper, and she's giving lip service to, if nothing else, maybe she really believes it, I don't know. I tend to want to believe that she's sincere in this. That she's saying, I wanted to have those conversations with people. I wanted to bring in some people that were not necessarily pro-abortion all the time, that's all they cared about, that were kind of on the fence about some of the moral issues or thought that there may be some shades of gray. I wanted to at least talk to them, and Planned Parenthood was saying, we ain't having any of that. It does show about the pervasive culture of Planned Parenthood. And one thing that is important to note about this, if you've seen the movie Unplanned with Abby Johnson, this confirms what she was saying in that movie and in the book that the movie is based off of. She was somebody that was a true believer that, we're actually trying to limit abortions. That's something she genuinely believed. And then all of a sudden, when she became a director and they started getting on to her about her reducing abortion, she said, well, I thought that's what we were supposed to do. I thought we were supposed to help women get contraceptives and other things that they needed so that we could get less abortions, because we were trying to get rid of the need for abortion before it ever happened. And then she was confronted in no uncertain terms by her mentor. And I won't give away the whole scene. If you haven't seen it, you absolutely need to. But you're seeing something very similarly play out here. That this lady, Leana Wen, apparently 100% bought into that lie that Planned Parenthood really wanted to reduce abortions, and it was all about informing women and equipping them and keeping unwanted pregnancies from happening. And then all of a sudden she finds out, no, that is not what they were about at all. They are trying to perform more abortions, as many as humanly possible. Because when Wen came up trying to reverse that, she was met with a whole lot of resistance, apparently. She goes on, there were early signs that this approach galvanized new allies and was moving the needle on public perception. Despite many shocking laws passed this year, more legislation to protect abortion access passed in 2019 than any year in recent history. That's also true. An NPR PBS NewsHour Mars poll last month showed support for Roe v. Wade was at its highest point in 4 decades. Again, terrifying, but also true. But in the end, I was asked to leave for the same reason I was hired. I was changing the direction of Planned Parenthood. Yeah, apparently they prefer the Cecile Richards, shout your abortion, be proud of it, don't try to limit it, abortion's the greatest thing ever approach. Apparently that's what they wanted. She continues on. Ultimately, my departure is not about me or the organization I continue to care deeply about. It goes beyond the movement for reproductive rights to the very ethos of our country. Can we put aside partisan differences to do what is best for the people we serve? Will the conversation continue to be dominated by a vocal minority from both ends of the spectrum? Or can there be space for those of us in the middle to come together around shared values? I hope so. We need to stop treating those whose views differ from our own with scorn and suspicion, and instead work together to safeguard our health, our rights, and our future. Now, I don't know if this is sincere, but like I said a second ago, I really hope that it is. I really hope that just for her sake, I know this does nothing, like I said, to move the needle. It doesn't really do anything policy-wise for Planned Parenthood, but I genuinely hope that she's sincere in this. That she wants to have this conversation, that she wants to talk with people on the other side of the aisle, because that's a healthy sort of outlook for it. And I am not one of the people that believes that anyone that is even somewhat pro-choice, in other words, they at least believe in abortion in some circumstances, is beyond the pale, that you can't talk to them, that they're just heartless monsters and you'll never get through. I don't believe that. And unfortunately, there are people on the pro-life side that do believe that. And this last part of the article, I actually think is being honest. Where she's saying, I wanted to have a good relationship with those people. I wanted to show some mutual respect. I wanted them to feel like we weren't their enemy. But apparently Planned Parenthood as an organization, they did want that. They did want to be the person with the bullhorn shouting down everybody else. And so I'll give her props for at least that. I don't know if it's sincere or not, but I genuinely hope that it is. And I think that it's a sentiment that all of us, regardless of our stance on any issue, needs to be able to have, because we need to be able to hear people that disagree with us, even with something that is as abominable and wicked as abortion. We still need to be able to take in criticism. We still need to be able to have a conversation with that person, because if we can't, then why would they even be willing to consider our views? How are we going to change hearts and minds if we're not willing to take that first step? And even though I think that this lady is wrong on a lot, I think she's right about that. And I think that this really does show the dark underbelly, which has got to be really, really freaking dark when you consider what they do out in the open. But it really does show the dark underbelly of Planned Parenthood. This is a person that still believes in abortion, still believes in the mission of Planned Parenthood, was absolutely a dyed-in-the-wool true believer in abortion, thinks it's a human right, thinks that, everything that you would expect from a president of the Planned Parenthood organization that was kicked out for not being hardline enough. That already being pretty far on that pro-abortion scale, I mean, about as far as you can get, you don't get to be the president of Planned Parenthood if you're really against abortion in any way. And even she wasn't hardline enough or radical enough or extreme enough to satisfy the bigwigs at Planned Parenthood. Says a lot about who they are as an organization. We'll take a break and we'll be back in just a second.
Hey, where you going? Champ? Slugger? Hey, cowboy. Where you going? Where you going?
I'm going out!
Hey everybody, it's Caleb here, and I was just driving through South Alabama. I had a couple quick thoughts that I'd like to share with you. First of all, I really love it when the environmentalists tell us that there just are not enough trees, that we're killing all the trees, that there are no trees out there. As you can probably see through the window there, South Alabama is just trees. There's virtually nothing. You got maybe Andalusia, Enterprise, and Dothan, and trees, and that's pretty much it, other than Gulf Shores, which is the beach. So I genuinely believe that it should be part of our criminal justice system that any liberal that whines too much about there not being enough trees, that their sentence, their punishment for that, should be to drive through South Alabama, because they will be immediately disillusioned about this idea that there are just not enough trees left in the world. There is nothing but trees for miles and miles and miles and miles. Another thing that I wanted to bring up, and it actually made me hearken back to a comment that was made, I would say a few months ago, by Hillary Clinton, talking about how the coast, in other words, the people in California and Oregon and Washington and then New England, that they all voted for her and everybody else voted for Trump, which, is true. And then she also talks about trying to essentially explain why that is. She says that, well, all the dynamic people, all the movers and shakers and the people that are making money, those are the ones that voted for me. It was the neophytes, the little people over in flyover country that voted for Trump. And goodness knows that I'm not the world's biggest Trump supporter. I didn't even vote for the guy in the first election, but one of the reasons that she lost that election in the first place, and one of the reasons that Americans in general are just so tired of that, is because there is a large contingency of the left that genuinely believes that only people in the cities are the ones that are dynamic and important. And I'm driving through South Alabama, and right now it's mostly just trees, but especially when you get a little bit further north. I was driving through here and I noticed there's so many fields with cattle and hay, and you get a little bit further south and you're going to see an awful lot of cotton and peanuts and some soybeans. And so I really do think, and I think that this is important to remember, that though there are people in the cities that tend to vote Democrat and have never seen a farm, have never been through, quote unquote, the flyover country, I think it's incredibly important for us to remember that, yeah, they may look their nose down at people like that, but if you were to actually take one of those people and have them try to survive in an environment where there were not the people producing their food and their fiber in states like Alabama, that those cities would immediately devolve into chaos and die. And I think it's so hilarious that the people in cities look down their nose at people in the country, people in farmland, that kind of thing, and then they wouldn't even be able to begin to have a similar lifestyle that they do if it were not for those people. And maybe I'm thinking about this because I'm an ag major and state convention for the Alabama FFA is coming up. But what it really all boils down to is that whether they appreciate it or not, whether or not they understand the relationship between their life and what they're doing and people in places like this that provide the lumber for the house that they live in or the building that they work in, and provide the cotton for their clothes and provide the food that goes on their table, they would quickly learn an appreciation once that stuff went away. Once they realized that the magic bread fairy doesn't just bring bread to the supermarket, that there are people involved in the growth and production and transportation of that, I think it would really paint it in a different light. And what I mean by that is, I don't think that it's productive for us to go out and talk about how silly and stupid they are and how ridiculous their position is on that, even though there's some truth to it. I think we do better catching more flies with honey than vinegar, and explain to them and talk to them and educate them about the important role of Middle America to the rest of the world, to the rest of the economy. Because the reason that we are an economic powerhouse, the reason that we have so many people that don't have to be involved directly in growing their own food and wondering where their food's going to come from one day to the next, the best way to do that is through education and helping them to understand that that is an important part of it. So let's just try to come at it from a diplomatic perspective, and hopefully they'll be able to realize at that point that it's important for them to appreciate the American farm.
That was stupid.
I know it was stupid.
Really stupid.
Hey, I just said it was stupid.
And today's Daily Dose of Stupid, Joaquin Castro, who is a representative from the great state of Texas, unfortunately not one of the better ones. He's a Democrat representative from the state of Texas. He has now proposed a bill. And as you may have guessed from his name, he is Hispanic. He has now proposed a bill to remove the terms alien and illegal alien from all official documents and laws. So at the federal level, at least, because this wouldn't do anything to states, but at the federal level, this bill would replace the term, quote, alien and illegal alien with foreign national and undocumented foreign national, respectively. This was his explanation for this. Joaquin Castro said, "Words matter. It's vital that we respect the dignity of immigrants fleeing violence and prosecution in our language. The words alien and illegal alien works to demonize and dehumanize the migrant community. They have no place in our government's description of human beings. Eliminating this language from government expression puts us one step closer to preserving their dignity and ensuring their safety." Yeah, a couple things. First of all, alien just means foreign. So how is that demonizing or dehumanizing? When I went to Ukraine, I was an alien. I was not an illegal alien because I came here with documentation and I had my passport. But the point is, when I left America, went to Ukraine, I'm from America, therefore I was an alien in their country. I was a legal alien. And by the way, I have no problem with illegal aliens coming into America. See, that's the thing. They're focusing on that part of it, when that's not the part that it should be the focus at all. I don't care whether someone's an alien or not an alien. I care very much if someone's illegal or illegal. That's the part that I'm focusing on, whether or not the person broke the law to come here or did not. Look, when it comes to legal immigrants and legal aliens, I know a bunch of them, gone to church with them, worshiped with them, eaten meals with them, hung out with them. One of the guys in my fraternity lived right down the hall from me, was a legal alien from another country, and he was a Hispanic guy. Had no problem with him. In fact, one of the most fun guys to hang out with, honestly. I mean, Diego was just, he was a riot. But the point is, like most Americans, right or left, got no problems with legal aliens. But see, that's what they're trying to focus on. They're trying to make you think that that's the issue. And you'll notice that he's trying to zero in on the word alien as though that's the problem. But you'll notice in the updated version, this is why you have to watch the other hand, this is a hat trick. You'll notice that he didn't change just the word alien. He changed the word illegal. He got rid of the word illegal. He changed that to undocumented, which just sounds like somebody lost their paperwork somehow. Not that they broke the law. And so they're trying to get us to focus on that aspect of it when really that's not the important part at all. Whether you call someone an immigrant or an alien or whatever, the point is, did they come here legally? Did they not come here illegally? That's what people focus on. That's what people actually care about. They're trying to distract you with this. Also, have you ever read 1984, George Orwell? Because you may remember. Now, granted, the main character doesn't work in this department. He works in another department. But in I believe it's the Ministry of Words or the Ministry of Communication, one of those, that in this particular ministry, what the heck? Sorry, I have no idea why my phone is going crazy right now. That's the second broadcast in a row that's been a problem. But anyway, sorry, I apologize for that. You may recall that in 1984, George Orwell, in his famous novel, one of the aspects of it was they had a ministry that was specifically dedicated to communication, and that communication specifically dealt with words. And what they were doing, according to the character that's having a conversation with the main character of the book, he says, people think. They think what we're actually doing is adding a whole bunch of words. That's what they think Newspeak, the language updates that are happening, that's what they think it is, but actually that's not what we're doing at all. We're eliminating a lot of words. We're getting rid of words. That's most of what we do. And that's exactly what the Democrat Party is trying to do here. They're trying to make words toxic so that it's harder to communicate, it's harder to talk about this issue. Because if you're constantly worried about using the wrong term or offending somebody, you're far less likely to actually make a good point on this. And they would rather you just think, it's too hard, it's too complicated, I don't want to have to deal with it, I'd rather just not talk about it. That's what they're really hoping for. And they're trying to take away any of the negative connotations that breaking this country's laws to come into this country, that's what they're trying to get away from. But just like in 1984, the way that they're trying to do that is not through honest debate, and it's not through making an argument or a case as to why this should be this way or we should enact this policy. The way that they're trying to do it is completely underhanded. By pretending that they care about the issue, but then they actually don't and they won't act on it. And then doing completely arbitrary, meaningless things like trying to change the legal language in this particular instance, even though the term that they're trying to get rid of is a completely legitimate legal term. But really what this story does is I think that it's a perfect microcosm of leftist thinking. And the reason that I say that is because the general rule between the general difference between the two parties is that the right cares about whether or not something is effective. In other words, whether or not it works or whether or not it does something good. Generally speaking, the left is far more worried about their feelings, whether or not it feels good to do something. You see, in this case, you can kind of look at the way that they're reacting to the crisis on the border and say, well, we could beef up security to Border Patrol, get more funding for them, and build a wall, enact drones, increase security, increase the equipment to our Border Patrol's forces to be able to detect certain things, to try to stop the legions of women and children and young men trying to cross the desert with very little supplies, sometimes ending in them being permanently injured or dying, having to deal with brutal coyotes, women and children being raped and sexually abused by coyotes when they come over here, putting themselves in danger to do so. And let's not even get into sex trafficking and all the other various diseases that could be coming across the border. Oh, and also the drug smuggling and countless other crimes that are perpetrated by illegal immigrants, largely because a significant portion of them happen to be criminals. Yeah, let's not look at all that. Let's just change the name of it. That's where the Democrats' priorities are. We've been dealing with this crisis for going on 50 years now. And the Democrats have been helpful at some times, changed their tune, and actually worked against efforts to get our border under control at other times. But the point is, right now, all of that, not a priority. Let's just ignore all that. There's no crisis. Everybody go back home. Nothing to see here. Oh, by the way, it's really important that we change what we call them in the law. Look, even if you believe that the term is derogatory, even if you believe it's dehumanizing, and I don't understand at all why you would think that, but even if that is your stance, can't we agree that we have more important things to worry about? Can't we agree that maybe we should just worry about actually solving the issue as opposed to being worried about whether or not we hurt someone's feelings? You see, in the mind of most leftists, unfortunately, Feelings are the only thing that actually matter. Whether or not they actually do something good, they accomplish it, doesn't matter. I mean, I could go through countless examples of this, but just right off the top of my head, LBJ is a great example of this. LBJ's war on poverty has been going on for 50 years, and poverty won. In fact, it's shown to have the exact opposite effect that LBJ was hoping for. And we spent billions upon billions of dollars on a massive welfare state, and here we are, 50 years later, still got poor people. And actually, we have more people not working than we did when he actually enacted that policy. But you see, it feels really good to say that we're going to do something about poverty, so the left doesn't care that it doesn't get results. It makes them feel good to support it. And because of that, they'll continue to support it. And so that's really the difference in the right and the left, and this story perfectly exemplifies that. Does it feel good, or does it do good? Because worrying about whether or not someone calls somebody an illegal alien or not, that's kind of like the biblical example to talk about the Sermon on the Mount of a man asking for a fish and you giving him a serpent. Or coming to your door and asking and saying, go and be filled. Well, yeah, that might make you feel good, but you're not actually helping the person. And that's what's being ignored right here. Let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Chaplain's report today comes from the book of Daniel. We are continuing our series on the book of Daniel, and you may recall that when we left Daniel, there is a chapter break here, but it honestly feels a little weird because it's in the middle of a narrative. And I don't know, chapter 12 is so short, I almost feel like chapter 11 and 12 should be combined into the same very long chapter, but for whatever reason, they decided to put a chapter break there. Obviously, Daniel didn't originally put one when he wrote the book. But this particular passage is a continuation of what we've been reading, where Daniel sees this vision, he sees the man in linen cloth, and he sees all these prophecies and has them explained to him about what they mean. And so this is the verse that is a continuation of that in Daniel 12, verses 2 through 4. Where he says, many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but the others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. Those who have insight will shine brightly like the brightness of the expanse of heaven, and those who lead the many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But as for you, Daniel, conceal these words and seal up the book until the end of time. Many will go back and forth, and knowledge will increase. Now, this is a really interesting passage, and I'm not even really going to get into the prophecy aspect of it or try to explain to you what this predicts, because we've already talked about that in some previous segments. But what's important to note about this particular passage is the imagery in it and why the imagery is the way that it is. First of all, it talks about those being risen from the dead. And that many who are risen from the dead, in other words, those that are asleep in the dust, rising up, that they will essentially be beacons of knowledge, that the light of knowledge will come from them, and that it will be like the stars in the heavens. Now that is really fascinating, because it essentially reaffirms the Christian mission. Now, is this talking about actual literal Christians here on earth? Well, there are some righteous people that were resurrected when Christ died, so I guess you could make that argument that it's being a little bit more literal here. But even if you're thinking of it as purely figurative, even if you're looking at it from the perspective of it just being symbolic of the way that God's kingdom is going to work, isn't it still pretty profound? That you have people, now they're not the sun, they're not the greatest source of light, they're not God. but that individual people here on this earth who are risen from the dead, not unlike Christians are risen from the dead again when they are baptized and come into contact with Christ's blood, rise up again just like Christ did, that once that takes place, you are counted as the risen, and it is your job, it is your responsibility to bring the light of knowledge to others. See, that to me fits so perfectly. Now, the way that this works and the way that this is worded specifically, I'm not sure if that's exactly what it's talking about, but the imagery does fit. And even if that's not explicitly what was meant by the prophecy, there is a commonality in theme here that certainly helps explain this process of Christians going and making other Christians. Not that we do the saving, not that we're the ones that originally came up with the knowledge, but we act as a lamp to them. We say, here is the light, here is God's word, this is the truth, this is the knowledge that I impart to you. What are you going to do about it? The way that that verse is reading, that it will bring brightness to the expanse of heaven, and those who lead the many to righteousness like the stars. I mean, if you're a Christian and you know that it's your responsibility to share the gospel with people, that kind of puts a pretty big burden on you, but it also makes you think, wow, I get to be a part of this amazing quest that God has put me on to share the light of knowledge with everyone. And I get to be a small part of that. That's pretty incredible. Another thing that it does is it kind of sets up the purpose of prophecy, because it almost makes you think that prophecy is really more for those after than the ones during whatever it's prophesying is going to happen. Because you'll look at the last part of that verse, and it talks about that light of knowledge being put forward to people, and then he talks about Daniel. He says, when you conceal these words and seal up the book until the end of time, many will go back and forth, and knowledge will increase. So, after Daniel writes this, and after the book has been sealed and people are reading it and looking at it and trying to understand what it's saying, its real impact happens after all those things have been predicted. Because the things that are predicted in prophecy, people couldn't have changed them. They couldn't have really done anything about it. And so where it really becomes useful is that A, it asserts God's authority, that if somebody's writing something, several hundred years before it happens and everything turns out to be true, then you know, okay, that guy actually was a prophet. You know what? Props to him. That guy actually was a prophet and he really did know what he was talking about. And his message must then, of course, be from an all-knowing God. So it did have the same purpose as miracles in the sense that it conveyed authority from God upon certain people. But it also makes you think that, wow, the prophecies really were not even so much for the people living in the time that the prophecy was fulfilled, but the people living afterward that could look back and say, oh, wow, there's some credibility to this. I mean, everything that he's saying happened. I need to read the rest of it and increase my knowledge, increase my spiritual acumen, increase my relationship with God, because this is clearly a God that has authority. So in a sense, the miracle of prophecy is the purpose of every miracle, is that it is there to inspire knowledge and curiosity and belief in God. And I think that it also gives us a purpose of the book of Daniel too, that knowledge will increase. There's some things in Daniel that even for somebody that is a seasoned Bible scholar, sometimes a little bit hard to understand. But the point is, God is not the author of confusion. He's the author of knowledge and wisdom and light. And so God wouldn't give us a whole bunch of stuff that we can't understand, nor would he give us stuff that was just there to confuse us. If we have this literature, we have it for a reason. And we have it because God believed that we could understand at least some parts of it that would help us in our spiritual walk with him. And so in a very brief, concise amount of time, we have the purpose of Christians and the purpose of those that follow God. And we also have the purpose of prophecy and the purpose of the book of Daniel as a whole. In a very short amount of time, God gave us an awful lot of rationale for why this is an important book to study. Stay the course, friends.
Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Any opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media. The theme song for Tactics is 6 Foot Town by Big and Rich. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Broadcast studios provided by Cumulus Media Montgomery. Location studios provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright 2019.